Welcome back. We're now in week 4 of the painting challenge to improve your watercolor landscapes. And this week is all about rocks and sand, the ground, the earth, what lies beneath your feet. Now, I didn't have time to paint as much as I'd hoped, but I did learn a lot this week, and I'm excited to show you one really fun way to paint sand. I'll also go over a few things to keep in mind when painting rocks into your landscapes. Let's go ahead and begin. I'm using 140-pound cold-pressed watercolor paper. I'm wetting the entirety of my paper so I can paint wet on wet for this first step. Now let's start adding in some color. I'll be using yellow ochre, laying down a light layer. This next step is entirely optional, but if you're like me and you love a little sparkle, go ahead and paint a light layer of metallic watercolor over your still wet surface. I'm using CSY Art Gallery's Golden Copper, just the smallest amount, enough to catch the light, like the specks you might see when you're walking along the beach. Now I'm adding some burnt umber for some color variation. Ready for the fun part? Let's sprinkle in some table salt right into the wet paint. I decided to go back and add just a little more color since mine were starting to fade a little bit too much. This will take a little while to dry before we can move on to the next step, so in the meantime, let's get started on those rocks. I'll quickly throw down a light background. Again, I'll be using yellow ochre. My paper was only damp when we began, so I didn't have to wait long for it to dry. We're going to be looking at this piece of paper in 3 sections. The top section will be the background, the middle of the paper, naturally, will be our middle ground, and the bottom section will be our foreground. I'm starting out by painting rocks in the background, very light in value. Again, I'm using burnt umber. I find myself turning to yellow ochre and burnt umber quite often when I'm working with these beachy scenes. You might have other colors that you prefer, but I tend to go towards these two. Our background rocks will not only be light in value, but also small in size. They won't have much definition at all, since they're too far away to really see any of the details clearly. You may even choose to sweep a clean wet brush over your rocks afterwards to blur those edges. Let's move on to the middle ground. These rocks are closer to the viewer. For the most part, they'll be larger in size and darker in value. We can start to see more of the details. I've decided I want the sun to be somewhere in the upper right, so I'll be keeping the top right sides of my rocks light and dropping in some darker values in the bottom left. These rocks are still a bit in the distance, so we might be able to make out two different values. We'll be coming back a little bit later to add some shadows. One really nice thing about painting rocks is that it's pretty much impossible to mess up, since rocks come in all different shapes, sizes, colors, and so on. No matter what you wind up painting, chances are there's a rock somewhere out there in nature that looks kind of like it. Now let's paint a pair of rocks in the foreground. These are the closest to our viewer, larger and darker than before. Keeping in mind where the imaginary sun is located, these rocks will have a light value in the upper right, a mid value all over, and a dark value in the bottom left. I'll try to work these three different values into both of my foreground rocks. I want to apologize in case my sound is a little bit off in this video. I just started using a new video editor and I'm still kind of working out all the nuances and figuring out how everything works. You can either paint directly into the wet paint like I am here, or you could wait for it to dry and come back and do another layer on top. When it comes to painting landscapes, I'm wondering if you have a favorite type of scene that you always go towards. Do you like to do beach paintings, or do you prefer mountains and trees? Or maybe rolling hills, farmland? Let me know in the comments if you'd like to share. I've lived in Southern California close to the beaches, so of course I'd gravitate towards beach scenes quite often. But I've also spent most of my life in the Pacific Northwest, so I love those mountain scenes with the huge trees. Because rocks are rarely just one color, let's include some green. The paint below is still wet, so the green is spreading out nicely, mixing with the brown. With a dry brush and a hint of burnt umber, I'm coming back in and adding some shadows. Now I'm using a clean, slightly damp brush, and I'm removing a bit of paint to make those highlights more prominent. As we discussed earlier, the background rocks are likely too far away to see much in the way of shadows, but I still want to throw in some dots and lines and random bits to anchor our rocks to the earth, just so it doesn't look like they're floating out there in space. All right, there we have it. Rocks in the background, middle ground, and the foreground. Now, remember that sand we were painting earlier? It's finally dry. So what I've done is I've taken my piece of paper to the trash can and just gently rubbed off all those excess bits of sand. Oops, I meant to say salt, not sand. See all that wonderful texture? And of course, a little bit of sparkle. This would look great with some water on either side, white foam resting on the sand. But for this project, let's just add some beach grass. In last week's video, we went over grass in more detail, so I'll link the video below in the description. Imagine walking towards the beach. You're getting closer to the water's edge, and there's all that long, overgrown beach grass, sometimes reaching waist level. You climb over a piece of driftwood and carefully step over a tide pool before reaching the smooth, level sand, wet under your feet. What's so nice about that sand technique using the salt is that you never really know exactly what you're going to get. I just love all these little variations in color and texture. It's so much fun to work with. We're almost done here. Let's just throw in a little bit of reed grass just so we have some added interest, and then I think we can wrap this project up. Thank you so much for watching week 4 of the Painting Challenge to improve your watercolor landscapes. I hope you'll join us next week when we talk all about the sky.